I just wanted to say at the outset that we are going to be talking about face-to-face acquisition and retention for this webinar. However, before we get a mass exodus based on that and your organization perhaps not doing face-to-face at the moment or not considering it, I want to stress that the approach and the rationale and most importantly the upside that we're going to share is very applicable for any acquisition method, including telemarketing, online, and even direct mail. So by way of example, the retention curve on the slide that you're seeing is from face-to-face acquisition, but this curve is going to look very similar for online acquired sustainers, telemarketing acquired sustainers, where you've got lots of loss in the beginning and then the curve starts to smooth out a bit. So whether this exactly approximates your curve, that general pattern is going to hold for folks that we're acquiring on a monthly basis, where you've got steep loss in the beginning and then things begin to smooth out. And this curve is your reality, and it tends to drive a quantity volume-based business model. And when you've got a volume-based business model, certain fundamentals of basic economics kick in. The demand, which is the charity side here, starts to outstrip supply, and sometimes the supply are the vendors and the agencies capable of performing this, but it also is the supply of donors. And as a result, costs go up and the yields go down. And if you're in a mature market, then that is very likely the scenario that you're facing: costs going up, yields going down, and a curve that looks similar to this, at least in the general shape. And so the question is, what do we do about it? And that is, of course, the purpose of today's session. The answer is both simple but not easy, and it requires us getting into the cause and effect business, the why and the what. And why don't people stick around, and then what do we do about it? And let's start with the first part first. Why are folks not sticking around? And I want to start with just some intuitive gut check rhetorical questions here. Do we think that the answer to this question might matter to why someone elects to stay or not stay? Having a strong connection to the charity, right? That seemingly would matter. And also, seemingly, what if someone has a really good experience in the street or the door or the event or with the telemarketing exchange, and someone has a really bad one? Doesn't it intuitively feel as though that might matter? And if we think that might matter, then we probably want to get in the business of measuring and managing that, and that's where this session is inevitably going to take us. But before we get there, I want to demonstrate some proof, some evidence for that intuitive feeling that their connection to the organization and the quality of the experience they have is important and explanatory, explaining why folks might stay and why folks might go. But let's start with a traditional answer on cause and effect. And what you're seeing on the screen is the result, the output from a statistical model. And that might seem scary and technical and only feasible for really large charities, but let's strip away the nomenclature. And what you're seeing on the screen is an indication of the parts of the business that are to varying degrees under your control that impact whether someone's going to stay or go. And why would you build a model like this? Well, you build a model like this because you want to get an understanding of where you ought to put your time and effort, because there's always a constraint on time and effort. Where do we put it, right? And what this is showing is a simplified view of the output from that model, whose purpose is to try to help us steer our time and effort. And the percentages are the relative importance of these parts of that face-to-face operation in explaining cause and effect. What is causing people to leave? And as you see with this model, and the model for your business might look a bit different, going to, in various ways, be showing up within that sort of analysis. The recruitment campaign, so that's all the time and effort around the copy and the pitch and all the other bits that go with it. Donor age, that is a well-worn truism that donor age has an impact on attrition, and the older they get, the more likely they are to stay. The individual fundraiser, etc. Most of these things are to varying degrees under your control, and it ought to dictate then where you put time and effort. Now, the problem with this answer, and again, this was derived through very fancy math, and then you can hire consultants or have people on staff to produce an answer like this. And the thing about modeling and stat software, and even the analyst that's pushing the buttons, is that it can be really fast and the model can look really good, but you never know what you're missing, right? And so what you're going to see unfold on the screen now is a very different answer on where you ought to put time and effort. And so this is data that is from a charity doing face-to-face, and we ran this model intentionally leaving out the data that we had collected about satisfaction and their connection to the cause, which you'll see here we call commitment, and we'll explain the details on how you measure that in a moment. But for at this juncture, just consider that to be a true measure of loyalty to the charity at point of sign up. And what you're seeing on the right is we reran the model, the exact same data, all these data points, trying to explain the exact same thing with the exact same purpose. Why do folks leave, and then where do we put time and effort? And this is the reality. This is what's actually going on in your business, in your operation, with face-to-face or telemarketing or online sustainer acquisition. These things are really important in explaining the why of attrition or retention. Commitment and satisfaction, and yes, age still matters. But all of these things are far less important when we have a true reflection of the business. Just some additional data points to help make the case that what we intuitively thought might matter, their connection to the cause or the organization and their satisfaction, matters. And so this is showing from a real charity their retention rates in months 1, 2, and 3, so those first critical few months of that relationship, and then the difference in the retention by people who are high commitment versus low. And so what this conveys implicitly, and I want to make explicit, is that just like you've got differences in age for people coming on the file that you recruit in face-to-face, you've got people who are old, young, and in between. You've also got people who have different varying degrees of commitment, and again, we'll share the details on how you measure that in a moment, varying degrees of commitment as they walk in the door, okay? And the reason that commitment level is going to vary is twofold. One, they may just have greater exposure to your brands, and it's generally true that just basic exposure to the brand, absent some real horrible negative, is going to accrue mentally to the positive, meaning as familiarity and awareness goes up, I don't need to even know that much about your brand. I'm going to be favorably disposed unless you've done something to change that dynamic. Okay, so that's one reason. They may just have greater exposure to the brand. The other, which is probably more important, is that they're going to have differing degrees of connection to the end game, the cause. So if you're a health charity and I'm someone who has the disease that you're raising money for, I've automatically got a greater connection to the cause. Okay? So those two factors are what explain in large part the fact that you're going to have differing levels of commitment for folks walking in the door, and this shows the importance of measuring that, and then we'll talk about how you manage this to improve the retention rate. And I guess let me also underscore here, yes, you could do this same sort of plot and look at folks by age, right? Just group them into over 45 and under 45 or something like that. And you would see a similar pattern, right? You know this. You know the people who are younger attrit at a much higher rate than those who are older. And while that's useful to know, it is pretty much known, meaning everyone on the call, I imagine, has direct or indirect knowledge about the effect of age. And you've probably already done all that you can do to steer the business around that by setting floors on the age, quotas, just basic business rules. You're already managing the business on age, and whatever lift it may have gotten you prior to managing the business on age, that gain has been gotten and there's nothing else to do about it. And the corollary, or the other question you ought to consider there is age is an unsatisfying answer on why, right? Because you've got young people who wind up sticking around and you have old people who wind up leaving. All I need is that basic reality, and it exists for everybody on the call, that you've got some young people who do stick around and some old people who don't, for us to be left wanting more, wanting some detailed, deeper understanding of cause and effect. Okay? And age is nothing more than, because you have that reality, because you have young people who do stick around and old people who do leave, what that suggests is that there's some underlying variable we're not accounting for, and that's what we're getting at here. Okay? So age is really just a proxy for capacity, the life stage, and that's not particularly interesting, and it's also not root cause, which is where we need to get to if we're going to have any sort of meaningful impact on that curve. So what happens if you put all this together? Start to not just measure these things, because that's the equivalent of one hand clapping. Last thing that you all need is more measurements, more KPIs, more metrics, and more reporting to nowhere. What we really need to do is not just measure, but actually manage. And this is a shining example of what you can expect if we get into this business of measuring the cause and the effects. This shows the 6-month donor retention improvement between control and test. These are newly acquired face-to-face donors. I would wager that there is no one on the call who has 80% 6-month retention. All right. So let's take a look at some of the particulars here on how we go about getting this data and then making use of it. So measuring of commitment, as promised, we're going to share the details here on what this score looks like. And one way to think about this is it's a quality of the donor measure. Age is a lousy proxy, which is the point we made earlier. It's a lousy proxy ultimately for quality of the donor. So if we want to understand the quality of the donor, we've got to get a direct measure. That's what commitment does. This is a scaled question, 0 to 10. It's these 3 questions. This is actually a screenshot from within the EverGiving tablet software. And this is self-administered on the street. That means that we get the commitment score for everybody. And because it's so predictive, and as you're going to see in a moment, very useful to change donor experience based on knowing this, it's really important to get this for everybody. This is as important as the bank details if you're going to move the needle on that retention curve. Okay, so it's very simple and easy to administer. These 3 questions never change. The individual response to the individual items is irrelevant. It's rolled up into a composite score, and we'll show the details of that as well. So this is how the donor experience begins to change ever so slightly in the beginning here. We need to learn more about them in order to meaningfully change the donor experience. Part of that is measuring this commitment level, which is done, again, at point of sign-up. The second part here is that satisfaction measure that we looked at. This, for probably obvious reasons, is not administered at point of sign-up because we've got that human element and we don't want to ask the newly recruited donor right in front of the fundraiser to rate that experience. So this is something that we do within the next 24 to 48 hours max, send out this standalone email. This could also be done as an SMS to ask for and measure the experience they had. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about how this gets used, and then I'm going to turn things over to James, who's going to peel back the layers of the onion here and show you how the setup works within EverGiving, and then we'll turn it over to Rachel to show you more details on the reporting and how you actually get value from all the data. So there's really, but as a starting point here on how we use this data, we want you to think about the two distinct parties that we have in this equation. We've got the donor and we've got the fundraiser. And by extension, there's really two parts of the business that can and should be managed with this new data: the donor experience and then the fundraiser management part. All right, so I'm going to show two examples of how we use this data to change the donor experience to positive effect, and then one example of how we would change the management of the fundraisers. And again, then hand it over to James, who will hand it over to Rachel, and we'll get more detailed and more specific as we go. So, as we've stressed from the jump here, this is not just about measuring this data and throwing it up in some dashboard. If that's all you're going to do, don't bother. The way that you start to use this data to manage the donor experience is what's illustrated on the screen. So we're measuring commitment and we're measuring satisfaction with the experience. We then apply automatic business rules to this donor-specific data. So I now know your commitment level and I know your satisfaction with the experience. I'm going to place you into one of four segments based on the data that you've provided to me about yourself, your commitment level and your experience rating. And this is about not just asking for information, but then being responsive to that. This is shared details about your donor. This is a perfect example of donor engagement, which is otherwise a pretty fuzzy, soft concept. This is donor engagement. You tell me something about yourself, I'm going to be responsive. And so this part is completely automated and therefore highly scalable. And we're going to send out a message that is specific to that segment. So someone who had a bad experience is of course going to get a different message than someone who had a good experience, and different opportunities in here depending on where that person falls within this four-way segmentation. The other way to start to immediately change the donor experience based on this new information that we now have about folks that is very predictive of whether they're going to stay or go, and as importantly, tells us why they might be a risk, right? It's either because they're low commitment, they had a bad experience, or both. And so one of the other bits that we strongly recommend to make use of this data and have any chance of bending that curve is sending out a list of this donors, and this all happens automatically. So it's not just collecting the data and it's not just managing, it's having the data work for you and the technology work for you. So this will push out a list to your in-house donor service team, or maybe it's an outsourced donor service function. And what you're going to get in that report, and this is a daily batch report, is going to show here are the people who got recruited, and here are their commitment levels and the satisfaction they reported, and any other open-end comment, along with contact details. This is a gold mine if you're in the customer service function, right? I get to follow up with people, and I have specific details on the experience that they had, their connection to the organization, and in a lot of cases, some open-end commentary. And this is probably first and foremost in our collective brains here. You're thinking about problem resolution, right? So I want to be able to sort this list, and we do that for you to get to the people who had a bad experience and really focus on the high commitment folks first, perhaps, since they're prospectively the ones that are going to have the greatest value to us. But this is also about just taking advantage of opportunities. There will be people who will have all manner of comment, as you've likely seen in the sort of feedback they may already be getting anecdotally, that is worth some sort of human interaction. And that may be sending them additional details. It may be addressing a question that they have about the organization and the business. But the point is, there's both a need and an opportunity, once these folks have shared something about themselves, to do the follow-up there. And we have lots of data and evidence that this cost, and this certainly has a cost, that human follow-up as a rough average is about $4 to $6 per donor, fully loaded, meaning I'm accounting for the cost of the labor and the time. It's about $4 to $6 per follow-up, whether it's a phone call or an email. You should just sort of bake that in. You get significant ROI. What does that mean? It means that the value of that interaction, whether I'm fixing a problem and just apologizing again, or addressing a question or taking advantage of an opportunity they've opened the door to, is going to have significant impact on the likelihood that they stick around. And that is the metric we should all care about. All right, so that's one example that happens right away. We're talking about the first 24 to 48 hours where we're going to meaningfully change the donor experience in that critical part of that curve. Here's another way that's looking at a more extended view of that donor experience, namely the first year. And what you're seeing on the screen is the result of a year-long first-year journey test. The control group gets about 10 communications per year. None of them are asking for money, but there's a few advocacy asks within this particular charity in this example. The test groups are the light and the heavy, and they're just getting more communications. Not asking for more money, but all these no-ask communications are intended to increase the connection that people feel towards the organization, and in short, trying to bend that curve. And the results you see here show what routinely happens when we talk with charities trying to bend that curve. They run a test over a few months or maybe the first year, and they've got really well-intended but off the mark kind of internal guesswork on what do we send, how much do we send, through what channels, in an attempt to bend that curve. This isn't actually the test we ran, though. The test we ran said, now that I know something else about these folks as they walk in the door, namely their commitment level, what does the theory around relationship building and the evidence say about how we ought to treat them differently? And what we hypothesized when we ran this test is that the low commitment folks, and you know this for everyone walking in the door, they need more of the content that was sent in these test groups. And this was content that was intended to help build the relationship. So with their lower commitment, so their strength of relationship is lesser, there's an opportunity and a need to build that with some additional content geared towards that. We hypothesized the exact opposite for the high commitment folks, that the extra content in these test conditions is making a sale that's mentally already made. And those additional communications are going to create frustration that the charity doesn't actually know them, and irritation at that wasted time and expense that they see coming through their inbox or their mailbox. So what did we find? Well, we found confirmation for both of our hypotheses, and the effect on the extra communications being very different and in line with what we theorized here, very different based on commitment level, right? So this is showing the impact on the low commitment people for sending additional communications. And in this case, you see there's sort of this Goldilocks opportunity that it's additional communications, but not too many, okay? And you get a significant, I would dare say, massive increase in year one retention. This is a 12-point, not percent, 12-point increase in the retention, okay? Correspondingly, this sending out of more communications had the exact effect that we anticipated. It decreased retention for the high commitment to people. All of this is buried if we just treat everybody the same. And as you can imagine, the rollout here is, the upside from rolling this out is massive, but it's just one of the ways that you can actually make use of all this data. All right, so here's an example on the fundraiser management side. What you're seeing here, each bar represents an individual fundraiser. This is a face-to-face example. This could easily be telemarketers. So each bar is a fundraiser. The color coding shows the commitment level of the recruited donors. And you can instantly see that the performance varies wildly. Just like you can already see on quantity metrics, number of folks recruited, that you've got some folks who are really good at that, some folks not so good, and a whole bunch in the middle. And the color coding here, this is some segmentation we do based on commitment level: high commitment potential, vulnerable, transactional. And the folks in green versus the ones in red are doing a really good job of recruiting in high commitment people, and by extension, the ones in the red are doing a lousy job of recruiting in high commitment folks. These people have all had the same training, same script, and in this case, we've actually controlled for the number of donors recruited. So all you're seeing on the screen are fundraisers that are already doing a good job on that quantity metric, that very short-term quantity metric. But we see that within this world, once we've got new data and a new understanding of the business, there's a whole lot of variance here. And all of a sudden, some of these fundraisers who looked really good on a quantity basis look really lousy on a retention basis. And I think that there's that axiom out there that we don't manage what we don't measure. And I would argue that's only partly true. In fact, the more accurate statement, we manage stuff all the time that we don't measure. We just don't do it very well, or as well as we could. And if we're going to manage the quality by just doing fundraiser training and using donor age as a proxy, it's not the same as directly measuring donor quality. Okay? So Rachel's going to go into more of the detail behind what you're seeing here and how you take advantage of this and how you can raise the bar and get more of the fundraisers to look like the ones in green. But first, and as we promised, I'm going to give controls over to James here, who's going to give you a whistle-stop tour within the EverGiving application, because as you've likely surmised by now, a key to understanding the business better requires avoiding these dreaded data silos. And we can't, for example, have commitment data sitting separate from the fundraiser data. So James, let me hit the magic button and give you some control here.
Okay, can you see my screen? Hello everyone, so my name is James Goodrich from EverGiving. Thanks very much, Kevin. I'm not sure if there are any participants here from my time zone, but considering it's now Wednesday, I'd like to highly commend you. If not, you'll probably be listening to the recording, which is far more sensible. Of course, a big hello to everyone else here live. So for those of you who don't know, EverGiving is used by charities and their agencies all over the world to support face-to-face fundraising. We're live in 31 countries, and a little more than 2 million new regular donors originate via our app each year. So Donor Voice and EverGiving have built a strong working relationship over the last few years as our paths cross more and more, and they ask us to help implement our service with their customers. Typically, what they do is contact us when they're getting ready to implement and find that, 1, to get questions implemented, and 2, to get data out as quickly as possible, that it was us they'd be working with. And between us, we've now made that process really easy, and I'm going to show you exactly how easy. So from our point of view, it literally takes roughly as long as this short presentation to implement from beginning to end. This is the form itself. The questions do differ slightly, but all we need is the questions, and we can drop them into any form. Here I have what you will see when signing up to Marie Curie face-to-face. I have a standard form that I've part completed. There's the contact details, payment information, and a donor survey section. I'm just going to fill in the donor survey questions and hit save. So this is Mr. on the fence, so he's number 5. I'll put 5s all the way through and go on to the next section, sign, and hit save. So here is what an account looks like in EverGiving. This is the dashboard, and if I move on to donors, I can see this record has been submitted. And yes, for the sharp-sighted, I do live next to Bondi Tony's burger joint. So this is what it looks like in EverGiving, the data once it's come through, but it needs to get to Donor Voice. To do this, they access the data via API. An API sounds very techy, but really isn't. It's like giving a computer the ability to walk through a door, on another computer and walk out with data. As an account holder with EverGiving, you want to make sure that Donor Voice can only access the data you want them to access when they walk through that door, and we do this with an exporter. So I come down to the transfer section and add an exporter. Now, Donor Voice will provide you with a CSV file that will look a little bit like this. It'll contain a list of fields that you want them to have access to on a campaign. So just very quickly, I'm going to create in EverGiving the corresponding what we call exporter, and I'm going to simply drop what Donor Voice sends you into EverGiving. It will import all the fields, and then all I need to do is literally map them to sources within EverGiving. So I'll just start out by adding a few here. So supporter's first name, supporter's last name, email address, gender, date of birth, fundraiser name, has access to every single field in your account. And I'm not going to go on, but you get the idea. There are also quite powerful transformation options. So if I want the date of birth, for example, to be in a different format, I simply go to Format Date and type in the format that I want the date to be in, and it will output it automatically. So this, if I don't know, it's 3, if I save this, all I now need to do is go to the main page, to the export section, and provide to Donor Voice this schema ID, which is 1701, and they will program in the connection, and they will have access to all of the pledges in a particular campaign according to the fields that have been programmed. Now, maybe I only want them to see pledges after a certain date. That can be done also. So I can just choose the capture date, and I only want them to have access days from yesterday. So if you have a specific point in the campaign that you only want them to access data from, that can be done. There's many conditions that you can apply to make sure that Donor Voice only have access to the exact data that they want. And from this point onwards, they would then have access to these fields in real time, so that they can get the data and they can crunch it and do their magic as quickly as possible. So that's it. Start to finish in literally just only a couple of minutes. And so if you are implementing with EverGiving and Donor Voice, all you need to do is contact Donor Voice and contact us with the questions, and we will do the rest. So that's it. So over to you, Kevin, and you can pass over to Rachel.
Thanks, James. Yep, let me hit the magic button here, and Rachel, you should now have controls to walk us through more detail on how we make use of this data for managing the experience and the fundraisers. Rachel, we can't hear you. You might be on mute.
Sorry, Kevin. Yeah, I am on mute. So thanks, James. It's really nice to see that it is so simple. In my experience as a fundraiser, whenever I've used the words data and integration and tried to talk about data, people's faces tend to go a little bit ghostly, a little bit white. So to see it being so simple to get those pipes connected between the two systems is absolutely great. So I'm going to give you a quick look at how you can really start to use that data to really improve retention, because it's one thing having the data, but it's another thing actually using it. So I'm going to look at the two things that Kevin mentioned earlier, fundraiser management and donor experience management. And there's a third element which I'm going to touch on, which involves a bit of analytical wizardry to predict which donors may be at risk of leaving on an individual basis. But let's start from the point that the data hits the platform. As Kevin went through earlier, after a daily API call, so the data is going to be pulled from the EverGiving platform, our platform is then going to automatically populate with the recruitment data and send out a survey invitation to your new donors with the express aim of getting one thing, and that's information about their on the street experience and their satisfaction levels. So we're going to be aiming to collect a sample of around 15 to 20% of people's satisfaction scores, which will then merge in with the 100% of commitment scores which we've already collected at sign up. So now we've got all the commitment and satisfaction data in exactly the same place as all of the other traditional KPIs that you'd be used to, things like donor age and average gift. So to jump to the platform dashboard, which is what you should be seeing on your screen now, I can show you then the first top level screen which shows these KPIs, and suddenly now we have some additional measures. So here you can see that you can filter by reference period, and we've got the donor count, the number of donors that have come in, the actual value, the financial value, and we've got donor age, which is a KPI. And these can be set to your KPIs. I should just mention actually that this is a demo platform, and the data that's in here is actually, it's an amalgamation of some real data to show you the actual real comments, but it's absolutely anonymized. So it's kind of a dummy campaign here. So if we look up here to the survey send and survey response levels, here we'd be looking to get about 15% of people responding, 15 to 20%. So there's some work here that can be done to increase the number of people letting you know their satisfaction scores. And also then down here we have the donor commitment scores, so this is the information collected on the street, and also the level of satisfaction. So this is a real kind of one-stop visual dashboard which can be used for management reports. It can be exported as PDF files, or the graphs can be pulled into reports at the touch of a button. So you can keep an eye on a daily basis on what's happening on your campaign. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail now, and we're going to look at drilling into the data that we have. Now we can look at this in lots of different ways. We've got an element dimension tab here, so we can kind of drill into the data however you like. But for today we're going to look at the recruiter level, and this is where we're going to start to be able to manage the fundraising campaign with a little bit more detail. So this is the campaign, and along the bottom here you've got all the fundraisers who are active on the campaign. And just very quickly you can see, based on volume, we've got 3 stars here. We've got Alan, we've got Michael, and we've got Richard, who are doing the most volume on that campaign. And we can have a look at different KPIs, so that's donor count. We can look at donor age here, and we can see our 3 stars there. They're doing okay. Richard is recruiting just a slightly younger donor, but nothing to be too worried about here. We can also go back in and look at the donor average value. Here, let's look at these 3 again. They're not doing too badly. They're not top of the pack, but they're certainly not at the bottom. We can still see that Richard is lagging behind the other 2 a little bit, but nothing to be too concerned about. I don't know what Paula's doing, but whatever she's doing, Paul could actually take a leaf out of her book. Now, there's kind of nothing here that you wouldn't have in your traditional reporting. So where it gets really interesting is where we start looking at the commitment scores. So this is the full campaign, and we can see that actually the commitment scores are varying quite a lot. Generally, 7.5 is a good one. Michael's doing 6.5, which isn't too bad. But here we can really start to see a problem. And we can pull these 3 fundraisers out. So we've got the 3 top fundraisers of the campaign, and Richard is getting in an average of 4.9 on the commitment scale, which actually isn't great at all. And so we might want to have a look into that. If we go to donor satisfaction, we can also see that here we've got a 4.38, a 4.77 and a 4.2. And so Richard again is lagging a little bit behind the other 2. Now that might not seem like a big difference, but if we take out the filter here and have a look across the whole pack, actually we've got fundraisers who are hitting 5 on the satisfaction scores, which is really where we want to be. So suddenly we can start to look at the fundraisers in a different way, and where Richard was one of our stars based on donor count, actually are the quality of the donors that he's bringing in any good. And actually when further down the line, when we're looking at his attrition levels, we'd expect them to be much higher than somebody who's recruiting a high commitment and low satisfaction donor. Now, where you can also cross-reference is here on this file composition tab. We've got our 3 stars, and you can see them here. They're Michael, who's doing 20% of this campaign, Alan, who's doing 10%, and Richard is 9.4%. So if Richard's bringing in 9.4% of the campaign and the donors are not particularly good quality, that's a big risk to the campaign. And if either the quality is increased for that whole 10%, or perhaps Richard is moved to a different campaign or increases gets some further training, you can start to see where actually this sort of fundraiser management is going to have a big impact on your overall retention rates. And the key is that we know this information now as it's happening, so we don't need to wait to see who's leaving at month 2, 3, 4, 5. We can look at this on a daily basis, and we can actually start to do something about it. So it's stopping the problem before it starts. Okay, so that's a little bit of the fundraising management side of things. There's a lot more that the platform can tell and show you, but I want to move on to show you some of the donor experience side of the platform that Kevin was talking about. Now, the platform is going to help you follow up in an automated way. Kevin mentioned the technology is going to mean that there's going to be everybody that fills in the survey is going to get an automatic email to thank them for filling in the survey, but it's also going to be tailored to what they told you. So we're not going to send an email waxing lyrical about their experience if they've told you that they've had a terrible time. So that's something that happens absolutely straight away. But then there's another layer, and here the platform is going to help you to manage this by way of pushing automated reports out, but putting donors into these buckets based on their commitment level and satisfaction level. So here we can see that we've got donors in this bucket here who are not committed particularly, but they've had a really good experience on the street. So we actually don't need to do much more with those donors. They've had an automatic email, you could thank them, you thank them for doing the survey, so they're quite happy and probably not worth spending an awful lot of time or budget on. Up here in this bucket, the committed donors but not satisfied donors is actually where you might want to spend some time and money, because these are the people that have told you that they've got a really strong connection to the cause, but they've had a really bad experience on the street. And they've signed up anyway, but these are the people who actually have the ability to be worth an awful lot more to your organisation. In addition to being able to push out data to the donor care team or to a call centre or your agency for that personal follow-up, we can also start appending the text comments that will come through from the survey. So the survey is focused on getting as much information from your new donors in 3 short questions. But the key to it is actually encouraging that text comment. And there's some really rich content that you can gain from there. We've had some of our partners have had people hand raise to become volunteers. We actually know of one donor who's now a hot major donor prospect because of the information that he gave in the survey. And this is also the part of the platform that's really going to start singing to the donor experience, and it's really going to start moving that lifetime value needle, because we can actually take what people are saying to us, listen and act on it. One of my favourite comments is actually, this is a live comment and it was down here. I was actually having a bad day, and doing something to help others actually made me feel better. This is a great comment as well for fundraiser motivation. It's great. In the particular organisation that this came from, it was shared with the whole organisation to raise the profile of face-to-face fundraising. It was shared back with the fundraiser who actually had the conversation with that person, and that's where this donor experience can also start merging in with the fundraiser management and also that motivation. We are seeing some really lovely comments come through, and that's really good feedback. But also we've had news of one of the charities using the platform received an email from a donor saying that the whole experience from start to finish was the best he'd ever had, because he was listened to and then it was followed up on. So you can start to see where actually putting the right amount of resource and budget in with the right people can really start to pay off. So the last bit that I want to show you is what we call churn prediction, and this is a really clever part of the platform, because after the initial recruitment phase, so we've had our data into the system, we've sent them the survey, and we've been able to manage that experience for both the fundraiser and the donor. We can then start to look at who is likely to leave before they actually leave. So we're going to pull in payment information, and we're going to pull in engagement information from your CRM and merge it with that really strong layer of commitment, satisfaction, along with the traditional KPIs such as donor age, donation value. And the analytical tool is going to give you, with a level of confidence, the donors who are at risk. So here you can see these are actually individual donors and the confidence level. And this is coming from all that data. We can look at it via recruiter. So here we can see these are the recruiters who have got this person here has got the most amount of risk, this person here slightly less. And so we can really start to look at who is it that might be going. The key here, and as a fundraiser, the golden bit is that it gives you the perfect opportunity to take action. So we can test moving people onto different products, we can test reaffirming their decision to give, we can offer them downgrades, we can put a piece of engagement material in front of them. We can test different things to really start to see what the best way is of keeping these donors aboard. Now, there's a lot more to show you, but hopefully this gives you a flavour of what the data and the platform and the tool can do, and also how easy it is to implement from a practical point of view. So I'm going to throw back over to